Some months after Sedgwick's terrifying review, Hooker, the only person to know the full extent of Darwin's heretical views, responded tartly in a letter to Darwin's comments about Gerard's work on species. "I'm not inclined to take much for granted from anyone who treats the subject in his way and who does not know what it is to be a specific naturalist himself," said Hooker somewhat pompously. Despite Hooker's protestations to the contrary, Darwin took this as an implicit criticism of his lack of experience as a naturalist and therefore his right to talk about species. "How painfully to me true is your remark that no one has hardly a right to examine the question of species who has not minutely described many," Darwin lamented, self-consciously and somewhat defensively as well. And to an extent he was right. The only way to become a recognised naturalist was to systematically work through a class, describing the form and function of each species within that class, classifying each member in relation to other members. Systematics, as it was called, was the sign of a real natural scientist. In what follows, I'll leave for later the arguments that have been made about the usefulness of Darwin's barnacle project to his species work. Instead, I provide a narrative that covers the period from Darwin's first tentative steps into classifying the Cirripedia, then his total and almost obsessive immersion, and then finally, some 8 years later, the return to species work. This module ends with the events that forced Darwin's hand and made him break cover and let the whole world know about his theory of evolution through natural selection. By autumn 1846, Darwin had finally finished describing the beagle specimens, apart from one single barnacle species. As Desmond and Moore have it, he anticipated a short descriptive paper. It would not take long. He had one species to describe after all, even if it was bizarre. Some months, he optimistically reckoned, a year at most. The species he chose was a bizarre burrowing barnacle parasite-like called Anthrobalanus. He started borrowing other barnacles to make comparisons and then started considering other groups. At some point on this trajectory, he decided to do the whole damn lot, the Cirripedia in totem. It was smelly, finicky, painstaking work, and the years rolled by. Darwin beavering away, often exhausted, over his microscope with his dissecting tools at hand in his study. Over the course of the 1840s, Darwin's health had been progressively deteriorating. It was stomach troubles, and it became more and more debilitating. Nothing helped him. Orthodox medicine seemed to draw a blank. Eventually, he's persuaded by some friends that he should try the cold water cure, and he resorts to this form of treatment called hydropathy, travelling to Malvern to put himself under the care of James Manby Gully. Gully was one of the foremost hydropathists of his day, author of many books that have been widely read by people like Charles Dickens. There was something of the society doctor about him, and certainly Darwin took to him immediately. The whole Darwin tribe, Emma, the children, the nannies, decamped to Malvern while Darwin underwent the water cure. After some months of the regime, which included plentiful supplies of clean water, constant bathing, walking, and eating healthy food, Darwin was feeling considerably better, and so he returned once again to the exhausting work of his barnacles. The task had almost become obsessive. One of his younger children was heard asking a friend where his father did his barnacles. Darwin may have still been thinking about his work on transmutation, but he had shelved the research beyond what he was doing with the Cirripedia. And then, in 1851, after a very long illness, his beloved daughter Annie died. Her death took place under Gully's care, although she had gone to Malvern when she was extremely sick. Both Charles and Emma were devastated by their loss. Charles would continue sporadically with hydropathy, but he would never return to Malvern. But he did return to the barnacles. In 1853, the first volume of his work on Cirripedia came out, and then by autumn he was nearly done. The first volume itself won him the Royal Medal from the Royal Society, which he received in November 1853. In the end, a month had turned into a year, and a year into almost 8, but he was done. Had this finally earned him his license to speak on species? He returned to the species work with alacrity, building his networks, collecting evidence from his correspondence, persuading, cajoling, sometimes begging for the information he needed to confirm his theory. One of these correspondents that he used was Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been travelling and collecting and collecting and travelling, and by the early 1850s was in Asia, in the Dutch East Indies, getting specimens to sell to finance his scientific endeavours. In late 1855, the not terribly prestigious Annals and Magazine of Natural History published one of the essays that Wallace had written, this as the Sarawak Law paper. Here he noted the close proximity between extinct species and very similar existing species. Charles Lyell, on reading the paper and knowing that Darwin was working on transmutation, warned him that someone was getting perilously close to his territory. Lyell could read between the lines. Darwin could not or would not. Deceived by Wallace's vague references to a creator, Darwin pushed it aside as another effort from the Paleite school. All thoughts of Wallace were put away as Darwin commenced working on his monumental natural selection. This was to be Darwin's great book that would overwhelm all opposition with the magnitude of the evidence. Certainly in 1856, when he commenced writing it, he was considering the possibility of going public. How many years it would have taken Darwin to write, nobody knows. Fate intervened when, on the 18th of June 1858, a package was delivered to Down House. In it was a paper from Wallace, with a letter asking Darwin if he might show Lyell the contents and perhaps get it published. On the face of it, the paper appeared to outline the self-same theory that Darwin had spent the best part of the last 20 years developing. Things were hard enough as it were. Darwin's young son Charles was dying, and now this. All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed, he wailed. Grief-struck, he left the matter in the hands of Lyell and Hooker, who brokered the solution of a joint paper with evidence to demonstrate Darwin's priority, a letter to Asa Gray in 1857, extracts from the 1844 essay. This was read on the 1st of July 1858 at the Linnean Society on a hot and sleepy afternoon, and no one seemed to notice. Wallace's blessing wouldn't arrive until January 1859, by which time Darwin was heavily into the task of reducing his incomplete 150,000-word manuscript Natural Selection into a shorter book, which would be published in November 1859 as Origin. Darwin was quite clearly concerned about his priority. We can see that when that parcel arrived from Wallace that took him so much by surprise. In the end, there was nothing more that he wanted than to be known as the person who discovered evolution through natural selection. However, we're left wondering why it took him so long to go public, and what would have happened if that package hadn't arrived? How long would it have taken him? And what exactly was it that was stopping him from telling people about natural selection? For as we'll see, Darwin was open with a number of people about the fact that he believed in transmutation, but those he told about natural selection were few and far between. In the next module, what I want to look at is the state of society during the period when Darwin was thinking out his ideas.